Hey, Jeff, if I say sneaker culture, is there a particular sport that comes to mind for you?
For me, absolutely. And I think this is something that's going to be very regional, very location specific. But I think, being here situated in the United States, knowing what we talked about last week, especially how we sort of ended the episode, as we start talking about sneaker culture, my mind immediately jumps to basketball. And I know that's not going to be the case for every place because I've been watching Ted Lasso. I'm just going through it, season 2, no spoilers. But I know that they have a large sort of culture around sneakers as well, at least in the UK, also known as trainers over there, that is more closely associated with probably soccer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like you, and I didn't grow up playing basketball,
Mm-hmm.
but I would associate, and there are a bunch of different sports that come into the mix here. But basketball is probably the one that comes to my mind first if
Well,
I'm
and
thinking about soccer, sneaker culture.
yeah, and it's interesting because as I think about let's say the big five sports, right? We'll say soccer is now prominent, even prominent enough that we're going to factor it in there. As I think about each of those sports, basketball is far and away the one that I associate mostly with sneakers and fashion in general, right? I think there's a lot of connotations, and it's probably attached to a lot of the sort of national and global appeal of some of the superstars coming out of that sport, high fashion, all this kind of stuff. And then I would say that maybe this is also sort of my own bias. I would say that then tracks to soccer a little bit for me. But again, I think there's, Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, these sort of global people who are now sort of fashion icons themselves. For hockey, American football, and baseball, I don't really associate any sort of particular fashion with any of those sort of sports, which again, that could just be my own bias, but this is
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, other than jerseys or something like that,
Yeah,
but
right,
I
yeah, there's
agree
always
that it
jerseys, yeah.
doesn't quite rival what we're talking about when we talk about basketball or maybe soccer. We talked about tennis a lot in the last episode,
Mhm.
and that sort of figures prominently in sneaker culture. Running, jogging, we talked about that as
Right.
well.
Mhm.
And another one that comes up, again, something that I wasn't into skating, but skateboarding is also definitely
Oh,
a big
huge.
part of sneaker culture. So one of the things we're going to do today is touch on some of those sports, a few of
Okay.
them, and talk about the crossover between the shoes and transition into sneaker as fashion. But before we dive into it, here we are, episode 2. Geography is everything. Geography is sneaker is what we're talking about. How about we do a brief recap on what we talked about last time?
That'd probably be helpful. It was a pretty densely information packed episode last week.
Well, so we talked about um, the creation of shoes that were specific to sports emerging in the 1800s, particularly the second half of the 1800s. We talked a bit about the rubber industry because that was one of the key industries that allowed these kinds of shoes to be made. In fact, when we use the term sneaker, as many people in the United States do, it directly relates to the rubber soled shoe that you can't hear somebody creeping around kind of thing like you could with a leather shoe. We talked about lawn tennis a little bit and how that was one of the sports that the industry, shoe industry, was trying to market towards the rise of leisure class, the elite in the UK, eventually the rise of leisure for the middle class and for the working class. And how over the 20th century, there's just been increasing interest in sports, both as spectators, but people participating in them as well. So this is also fed into the interest in developing specialized shoes and the interest in consuming these shoes as well. We talked about a bunch of different companies, Keds, Converse, Dunlop, Adidas, Puma, Onitsuka, Nike. We mentioned some others as well. And these brands figure very prominently in the world of sneakers necessarily. And we talked about production a little bit, and we'll get into that some more today as well. And the idea that most of the shoes in the world and most of the sneakers are made in different parts of Asia, and so we'll hit upon that as well. But today, to continue on with this theme, there are 3 sports that I want to touch on that relate to sneakers and sneaker culture, and that is soccer, aka football,
hmm
skateboarding, and basketball.
Oh, cool. Well, I got 2 out of the 3.
You did, yeah.
My original answer.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, we could talk about others, and there are others that play into this, but these are the ones that I think is useful for us to talk about and have a lot to do with this topic.
And you know what's funny is I'm remembering this from last week's episode, from last week's intro question, when you asked me sort of what sneakers I wear. One of my sneakers is by a company named Vans, which I think is closely associated with skateboarding culture. I'm not. It is. Okay.
Yes.
So in a way, I kind of got all 3. That's what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you are from Southern California, right?
I am originally. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And Vans are from Southern California originally as well. I don't know. Is that a Southern California thing for you, or is that not necessarily a geographic thing for you?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a geography attached to Vans. Largely, I don't know. I think I always assumed that. I actually didn't even know they were from Southern California until you just said that.
Okay, wow. All right.
So,
well,
I was pretty unaware.
We're going to learn a little bit more about the geographic aspects of some of these soccer, skateboarding, basketball, and how they develop around the sneaker industry. But let's talk about soccer.
Let's do it. Love it.
Primarily because it's one of the first in the contemporary way of thinking about things that really starts to develop. In the 1950s, Adidas begins to focus on designing and manufacturing shoes for soccer. And in the UK, where soccer originated, and if you want to find out more about that, then you can go back to our World Cup episode, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
Little tie-in there for that. The design of soccer boots hadn't really changed much in decades. And, when you're talking in the UK about what you wear to play soccer or rugby, you're talking about boots, and they were very much boots, leather soles built for rugged contact, and for, kicking around in the case of both those sports, I guess, heavy leather soccer balls. And so you needed something very durable there. And so
also interesting, like I'm thinking about the UK broadly, very wet, rainy, part of the world. Leather soles probably don't have spikes or cleats or whatever attached to them, or probably not as prominent. I imagine that would make it
at some point
slippery.
They came up. I don't know when that would have happened, but they must have had to innovate that at some point, because otherwise people would have been sliding all around.
Exactly.
And so, Adidas, which is a company that starts with the Dassler brothers in 1924 and then becomes split into Adidas and Puma. We explained all of this in the last episode. Go check it out. Starts to find an opportunity to specialize something for soccer. And in 1954, what would have been the West German national team wore Adidas at the World Cup, which is a competition that they won. And so this is part of what brings Adidas in prominence into the soccer world. And also they're innovating design, which hadn't been done a lot. So they're one of the companies that's really trying to do that for the world of soccer. By 1961, Adidas was the largest manufacturer of soccer shoes on the planet. And then also in 1961, Adidas entered into a distribution agreement with the English sportswear company Umbro.
Oh, I know that company. Yeah. That's a pretty large one, right?
It's a pretty large company.
Yeah.
And so this is their way of finding inroads into the English market, to the British market. And by, I guess, 1966, most players wore Adidas in the World Cup, including most of the English players. And this is the year that England won the World Cup. So Adidas starts to be conflated pretty strongly with soccer, particularly for the athletes at this time.
And if I'm just on Umbro's website, because it got me thinking, is like, what kind of, sneaker apparel they might have. And actually they don't really do all that much in that. They seem to be mostly uniforms.
Right. And so that sort of tracks as well, that it would, that would make sense for them to form an agreement with a shoe manufacturer to become part of their profile for the apparel that they're producing. So in the 1970s, now, Jeff, do you remember, I'm not just asking if you remember, but do you know what the most successful Premier League, what is now the Premier League team was in England in the 1970s?
I mean, I would guess Manchester United, but I have no idea.
The answer is Liverpool.
Oh, really? Okay.
Liverpool
I
was
had no idea.
What Manchester United was in the 90s, maybe.
Okay.
And subsequent to that, Liverpool was the dominant team in the 1970s. And the supporters, the young supporters of Liverpool, started to transform the traditional look of soccer supporters that had happened before. And they're bringing on a new fashion, which is a new terrace fashion, which is a term that's used. It refers to the terraces, the standing terraces that they used to have in the UK. And part of that fashion trend that was established in the 1970s involved wearing Adidas trainers, Adidas sneakers.
Mm-hmm.
And Liverpool, as they were very successful, are traveling. The fans and the supporters are traveling to support their team, not only in England, but throughout the continent as well, as
Mm-hmm. Liverpool
is featuring very prominently in some of the European level competitions. And so soon this look spreads throughout England and probably starts to get some purchase in different parts of Europe more broadly as well. And that one of the shoes first associated with this trend was the Adidas Samba.
Oh, that's what I have. I have some Sambas right now.
Right. It's a very iconic shoe. I'm not sure a whole lot of people wear them for playing soccer.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's more for an indoor thing. It's interesting because they're called Sambas, but they were originally designed to wear in cold weather, apparently, because you don't need spikes when the ground is frozen and hard and things like that. And so that was one of the shoes that was first associated with this fashion. And then many fans started to also gravitate towards Stan Smiths, which we talked about in the last episode as well, which is the tennis shoes, very iconic as well. And eventually soccer supporters, they start to bring Adidas styles that are unavailable in England from the continent. And so they're starting to bring in different looks. In the mid 1980s, the key street shoe was the Adidas Trim Trab, which has got a molded sole. And so it's really through this phenomenon of young supporters wanting to sort of come up with a new look to separate themselves out a little bit, to be distinctive. And this is part of what develops into a street culture involving things like Adidas Sambas, and particularly Adidas shoes in general, which starts to transform into other things as well. That's part of the story of sneaker culture that comes from soccer.
Right. I mean, I think we see this in a lot of different ways where there's the official branding, right? Like all these supporters will probably have they could have a jersey, they could wear, whatever Liverpool's colors is. I want to say red. Yep. So that's correct. But then, also attaching yourself maybe as like a part of the in culture as wearing this other thing. It's sort of an identifier, right? It's something that other people would see and notice and say, oh, this person is, part of that, even closer in culture to this attached to this group that's attached to this soccer team, this club.
Well, and I think among some of the supporters, there was a reputation of intimidation, of rowdiness, and these kinds of things, and fans from other places started to become wary of that kind of thing. So wearing something a little less explicitly, not wearing the jersey of your team or something, was a way to be known, but not be quite as flagrant about it, so that you'd be easily recognizable by other people. And so there was a little bit of a code involved in that as well.
Yeah, I've heard similar things. Yes.
I mean, there's more to say about that, but let's take a little bit, bite-sized chunks out of these different things and turn our conversation now to the United States and to skateboarding a little bit.
All right.
Which strikes me now would be a really fantastic theme for an entire episode.
Oh, absolutely.
Were you a skater at all growing up?
Oh yeah. I had a skateboard. I probably skated for 5 or 6 years, from probably 13 up to 19, maybe even to 20. Probably when I sort of hung up my...
So your entire teenage years were skating years.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, this is sort of an aside, but this kind of blends our two segments here of soccer and skateboarding. But back in 2010, when I moved to Portland, or 2009 when I moved to Portland, I can't remember which one. But I went to a Timbers game and they had a promotional giveaway, which was a Portland Timbers skateboard deck.
Ooh.
So it has the old logo on it and everything. I actually still have 2 of them today. They're still inside my house right now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, so skateboarding, let's talk about the origin of skateboarding a little bit. Skateboarding becomes popular in California, I think particularly Southern California in the 1960s, and then subsequently through many parts of the United States. And this happens in a few different waves, and people who know a lot about skateboarding would probably be able to demarcate that pretty well for us. Mm-hmm. And there was some interest early on among a few rubber or shoe companies to make a specialized shoe, because one of the things, and you could probably tell me more about this, is that when you're skating, you can really chew up your shoes pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, that you can go through them really fast, especially. I think it depends on what you're doing exactly, but I would go through shoes, I would say, fairly much faster than I do today.
I mean, one of the key ways to stop on a skateboard is to drag your foot on the ground, yep. Right? And so that necessarily is going to cause some erosion of your sole and that kind of stuff.
Not only that, but like I just remember, trying to do tricks, you're jumping off your skateboard, sometimes your shoe will drag against something else, or it'll just sort of fly off and go somewhere, and all of a sudden your sole is hanging out. It's like it's very, very tough on shoes.
That's right.
In general.
Well, and this is exactly why some companies are thinking, well, this is a popular thing. Let's innovate something that will allow people to wear these shoes a little bit longer, and then we can specialize and market towards people who are skateboarding as well. And there weren't a whole lot of companies that were doing this in the 60s, because I think there was still perception this could be a fad. But one exception was the Randolph Rubber Company that launched something called the Randy 720. And the 720 is a technique, apparently, in the skateboarding world, in 1965. And this was a shoe that was marketed as a skateboard shoe, although it was really similar to many of the other sneakers that existed of the day. And, at the initial interest in skateboarding in the mid 60s, there was this initial skateboard boom that started to decline nationally in the late 1960s. And so the Randy 720 was no longer made. However, a small subculture keeps skating and the skate culture alive. And then that's sort of going to reemerge in the 1970s when it starts to rebound. And one of the reasons for the rebound, and this is, I guess, a little bit to the side, but is because of the innovation of polyurethane wheels.
That plastic?
Yeah, some kind of plastic. So, because otherwise there would have been wooden or clay, right, which would have been a pretty bumpy ride, I would imagine, and probably wouldn't have lasted that long. But if you have polyurethane, some kind of plastic rubbery material that can absorb a lot of the shock and be a lot more resilient, that probably adds a lot more to the allure of skateboarding and the ability to do skateboarding well. And so by the mid to late 1970s, skateboarding becomes extremely popular again in the United States. Now, one of the other reasons for mentioning the Randolph Rubber Company is because a former employee of the Randolph Rubber Company was a guy named Paul Van Doren. And he founded the Van Doren Rubber Company in 1966, and then opened up stores, and it was direct-to-consumer type thing. And the stores were called Van stores.
Oh,
it's part of his name. Yeah.
I probably should have caught on with the Van Doren. I did not know that's where that was going. I always assumed Van was, I don't know if I heard this somewhere or just something that I thought of, because, sometimes I just think about where names come from, but I always thought that Vans was called Vans because at one point they were sold out of a van.
I think that did happen as well. But I think the name comes more from Van Doren than anything else. But so in 1966, the first Van store opens in Anaheim, California.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
By 1974, there are 70 Van stores that are open all over the place.
Wow.
And you can't, apparently initially you can't buy these shoes in other stores. You have to go to a branded store. There was probably a mail order situation. So Vans become one of the preferred shoes, along with the Nike Blazer, which is interesting because I was looking at some old images of skateboarding from the era. And I'm talking about the Z Boys, right? So Jay Adams, Tony Alva, Shogo Kubo, Stacy Peralta. There was a movie called Dogtown Z Boys that Stacy Peralta made. Of course, he was one of those skaters, which for people like me who weren't really big part of the culture was pretty informative to learn about how, during these drought years in California, when the pools would be kind of empty, they couldn't fill them. They would sneak into places, drain the pools of people who were on vacation and skate in the bowls of the pools themselves. And this is one of the things that contributed to skateboarding becoming what it is. And that Vans, pretty quickly became pretty popular there. I think that I can't remember which of these skaters, maybe it was Tony Alva, that had a sponsorship with Vans and, suggested different colorways because that was really attractive to people. And then to reinforce the heel a little bit, which I can think of some Vans high tops that sort of have that feature as well. Nike didn't really embrace the skateboard market at this time, even though the Blazer was something that people were wearing. They would subsequently do that later on. But it's interesting to think, had they jumped on that a little earlier, how the history of Nike may have played out a little differently. In the 1980s, a number of different skateboard shoe companies emerged, including DC Shoe Company, Airwalk. In 1986.
Those were mine. Airwalk was the shoes that I would wear when I was skateboarding.
And I think about them as being a little extra padded, a little chunkier, maybe.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny thinking about skateboarding as not only within the context of the shoes, but also as being within like sort of the larger fashion industry at large.
Yes.
Right. Because it's so inherently different from what we've talked about already, which is soccer, and what we're going to talk about, which is basketball. Both of these having people who, at least today, are kind of would be considered more like high fashion, right? These are like global celebrities. Whereas skateboarding then, and I would argue probably even still to this day, still has more of an undercurrent of rebelliousness, counterculture, all this kind of stuff, sort of the fashion for the others, for the people who want to brand themselves as a little bit different, right? And so I can kind of see also tying back into sort of Nike, why Nike didn't necessarily jump into this, because Nike is absolutely not counterculture.
Right. Yeah, no, they were capitalizing on the top athletes, those kinds of things. And although I think the idea of being a rebel has tied into Nike's marketing and brand identity subsequently, that's not really where they were at necessarily in the 1970s when they were a running shoe company more than anything else. And then basketball initially a little bit. One of the other things when I think of Vans that is kind of a high profile moment involved in the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which I'm realizing came out before you were born.
I have seen it. Yeah.
You have seen it. Yeah. And so Sean Penn was the lead in it. And was this stoner guy named Jeff Spicoli. And there's a number of scenes where they're featuring the checkerboard slip-on Vans, which is, I think, a really big boost. Obviously there are people in the skate culture who are all about it, but to a national audience, all of a sudden this raises the profile of the company and that particular shoe. And I mean, we could go down the line with, and maybe we will later in the episode, and mention a few other moments. We mentioned Onitsuka Tiger with Bruce Lee and The Game of Death, but there are moments when a shoe gets featured in something that has national attention, which gives it even more of a amplified presence in the popular imagination.
As soon as you said that, the image immediately popped in my head. I know exactly what this shoe looks like. And then I just went over to the Vans.com website and boom, there it is.
It's right. It's front and center still, right?
It's iconic. Yes. Very iconic for Vans.
So, I mean, there's more we could say about skateboarding, but this is just a little bit about skateboarding beginning, a couple different waves, and how some of the shoes become adopted and then become very popular. And now, of course, people who don't have anything to do with skating are wearing Vans. It's a pretty popular brand.
Absolutely.
Let's take a break. We'll take a dip into some commercial advertisements here, and then we will come back and talk about basketball.
That's our lure for you to come back, because basketball, especially if it's in the United States, this is going to be a big topic for you.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We will be right back.
Welcome back. Hunter and Jeff here talking about Geography is Sneakers on the Geography is Everything podcast. We talked a little bit about soccer and skateboarding and how those shoes enter into the street culture world. Let's talk about basketball, Jeff.
Let's do it. I mean, we teased everybody before we went to commercials, so now we're kind of bound to do it.
We're obligated. So it's hard to imagine now, but for about 50 years, most players, and this was into the early 1960s, into the 1960s, the mid 60s maybe. For
Not
50 years,
yeah,
right, not that long ago, most players wore Converse or Keds on the basketball court. I mean, Converse All-Stars, as we mentioned, they're a great, iconic shoe, great style, but not a whole lot in terms of arch support. So to be jumping around in the basketball court in those seems like it could be a little dodgy at times.
Seems like
and the
a nightmare.
design hadn't changed much for either Keds or Converse during that time.
Mm-hmm.
So the German sneaker companies, Adidas and Puma, are evolving different designs and innovation and sneaker design. And Adidas and Puma both begin making inroads into the NBA in the late 1960s. There's a team that doesn't exist anymore, which I don't think we did highlight in our regional sport team moving episode, but San Diego Rockets in their first season at the NBA, their inaugural season, 1967, 1968, wore Adidas sneakers.
No, so really quick, yeah, we absolutely didn't highlight the San Diego Rockets. In fact, I've never even heard of the San Diego Rockets.
I don't know when they moved to Houston, but
yeah.
And this is a team that I think didn't do that well in their inaugural season, but yet it was an entire team wearing Adidas sneakers.
Mm-hmm.
And the Celtics, who we all heard of, if you know basketball at all, wore them the following year, and they won the championship that year wearing Adidas. So this starts to launch them into the NBA.
That's a big lift for sure. Yep.
One of the Adidas basketball shoes, one of the two main models that was designed at this time was called the Super Grip.
Okay.
Now, I hadn't really heard of that before.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it either. Yeah.
However, the Super Grip is redesigned a little bit and re-released in 1969 with the name Superstar.
Oh, I think I have heard of Superstar.
I think you must have heard of it.
I mean, basketball fashion is not like my super forte, but I'm clued in here and there.
It's because the Superstar is now an enormously popular shoe still.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the Samba recently the sales of Sambas have been extraordinary over the last year or so. 3 or 4 years ago, it was the Superstar. So it's interesting how, although innovation happens, the classic shoes, and we mentioned Vans, we mentioned Converse All-Stars, there still is a market for the classic shoe as well. By 1973, and this is amazing, approximately 85% of NBA players wore Adidas shoes.
Interesting. Wow, that's a huge amount.
Right. And so in a very short period of time, in less than 10 years, Adidas had a huge market share of NBA players.
It's interesting too, because I mean, we last week we talked a lot about Air Jordan, sort of Nike, sort of how they sort of became a fashion icon specifically through Michael Jordan, and which is now known as a hugely important basketball player, or was at one point. And it's just interesting. I don't necessarily think of Adidas being tied to basketball. I mean, think of Adidas being tied to soccer and all of the Major League Soccer and a lot of English and Spanish and German teams and XYZ, but I don't necessarily associate them with basketball. Not like I do. I would say Nike.
Yeah, well, they're largely displaced, I think, in the basketball world in the 1980s by Nike. But Puma was also pretty big on the scene in the NBA and in basketball in the 1970s. Walt Clyde Frazier became the first NBA player with a signature shoe, or one of the first players at least. There was a shoe that Puma made called the Basket, which was soon renamed the Clyde. And one of the things that Frazier wanted was a different material. So they started being made out of suede. And this became this is an iconic shoe as well, extremely well known. Around the same time, in 1971, Adidas signed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to a contract. So Kareem had a shoe with Adidas He had been wearing probably All-Stars or something before. And then in 1976, Dr. J, Julius Erving, signed with Converse to endorse their All-Star Pro Leather model. So in the 70s, you start to get these different companies having sponsorship with some of the top athletes in basketball at the time. And then in the case of Frazier, Clyde was well known for his off-court style, his fashion style. And so the shoe pretty quickly became popular as a street style in the 1970s as well. And then by the end of the 1970s, the Superstar and the Clyde had become very popular street shoes. And this is popularity in a lot of ways driven by young people in New York City, driven in large part by African-American youth, and by, young people who are playing on the mini courts of New York City, playing pickup basketball, developing street ball. And these shoes that they're wearing have become very desired, not only by these athletes, but by people who are looking to, emulate and rock a particular style. And these shoes become very popular for that reason.
It's interesting now that we're like talking a lot about the place associations with some of these styles based on sort of maybe the sport that it's coming from. We talked before the break, we talked about Vans and skater culture and sort of that bubbling up in California. And now that we're talking about, basketball and sort of the fashion, sort of the brands that are bubbling up in New York, I'm immediately thinking, oh yeah, obviously, like I associate still to this day with sneaker culture generally as being something that is derived from New York City, right? That's something that, and I don't know where exactly that I'm getting that from, but it's probably through, decades of cultural influence based on what we're talking about right now.
That's right. And then you had people who started to innovate their own designs with shoes as well. And I think this was happening in different places, but New York was one of the places, New York City is one of the places where people started, drawing and putting their own art on shoes, and this becoming, fantastically popular as a way of being distinctive. And the idea, this helps contribute to this idea that wearing particular brands helps display a particular personality. And the same was true with Vans and skateboarding culture and Adidas and soccer culture, the terrace culture, that particular brands become associated with particular subcultures and particular ways of promoting what today would be called a personal brand.
Right.
Now, Nike released the Blazer, which was in 1972, and this was for the Portland Trail Blazers, right? This is before they won their championship in 1977. The Low Top Bruin in 1972, and then the Air Force One in 1982, which I think was quickly discontinued, but then re-released in 1986 and became very popular after that. I remember, and talking about the Blazers, that Rasheed Wallace, having his choice of shoes, started wearing Air Force Ones again, like on the court when a lot of people weren't. And there was a lot of attention brought to it at that time. The Air Force One is an immensely popular shoe today in the contemporary, non-basketball culture. I see Air Force Ones, people wearing them all the time.
I just want to point out that as we run through a new shoe, because I'm not really into sneaker culture, but as we run through each new shoe, I'm Googling what they look like. And usually as I see them, I'm like, oh yes, I know that shoe.
See, it's interesting because I don't consider myself, a sneakerhead, right? Like somebody who's has incredible passion collecting sneakers, knows the stories behind it, knows the materials behind it. This is a big subculture, but I'm realizing that I might know more than maybe your average person on the street about some of these things. So I could be a sneakerhead in training if I worked really hard at it, I think, because
certainly at this point,
after this research, I know a lot more. I knew a little bit before, but now I feel like I know, and I want to learn more. I mean, I find it very fascinating.
It's very fascinating. Yeah.
So the cultural impact of those Air Force Ones coming a little later in the mid 1980s. And of course, any sneakerheads listening to this would want to add much more nuance and probably correct a lot of things, but that's cool. That's great. We're the layperson here trying to break it down for everybody. But the 1984 release of the Air Jordan, we talked about this in the last episode, changed a lot in the sneaker world. Jordans had more color, the red and black of the Bulls. We talked about that the NBA had mandated a mostly white shoe as the standard shoe that the whole team would wear, and how Jordan was maybe assessed a fine for this that Nike paid, and how this was marketing gold basically for Nike and for Michael Jordan. And I think since that time, as you mentioned, it's Nike is the basketball shoe, right? I mean,
that's my association. Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know if that's necessarily tracks with how many deals or who has various, representation on the court. It's just something that I immediately associate basketball with Nike.
Well, Nike signed a contract with LeBron James to be, the next big thing, right? I mean, they have contracts with many athletes, but LeBron signed a contract having not only ever played an NBA game before, but never having played a college game before, because he came right out of high school and went from high school to the NBA. And of course, this is not the venue to have the Michael Jordan, LeBron James debate. You could throw in Kobe and a bunch of others as well. I don't want to even get near that. I think there's a little generational kind of bias that usually kicks in at this point as well. Yeah. But we can transition over, because we're talking about, all right, 1970s soccer terrace culture, 1970s skateboarding culture, 1970s basketball, and also the health and fitness trend of the 1970s in the United States, where running shoes become really popular. And so this is, I think, the time, the 1970s, is like a time where there's really a transition towards a new level of street fashion where sneakers are very instrumental. There's a store called the Athlete's Foot. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one before. It opened in 1971. You've probably heard of Foot Locker before.
Foot Locker, I definitely have heard of.
That began in 1974. And by 1984, there were over 600 stores across the United States. And these were stores that existed primarily to sell sneakers, right?
Yeah,
that really wasn't a thing before, other than the van shops, right?
Mm-hmm. That's my image, right? I can see the Foot Locker in the mall, because they're always associated with malls for me. I can see that. I can see all the shoes that are in there, and I think they're all sneakers.
And then what did their employees wear? Do you remember?
Isn't it like referee uniforms, or
they were
like
wearing
the referee stripes?
The zebra stripes of the officials, as if to lend extra authority to the employees, that they knew what was going on.
That was smart branding right there.
That was good branding.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And now also in the 1970s and the 1980s, sneakers start to become conflated not only with sports, but with other aspects of popular culture. And I'm thinking music in particular here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm the Ramones, famous punk band from the 1970s, and wearing Converse and wearing Keds, like to realize that Joey Ramone was wearing Keds, was like kind of a moment, like that these were seen as the sort of working class, lend itself to this sort of DIY kind of stripped down kind of idea that went along with the punk aesthetic. But the other thing what's that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that, like, talking about the Ramones and Converse, as I was growing up, I was sort of in the skater sort of punk culture, and I wore certain shoes for when I skated, but otherwise I had a pair of Converse, right? That was like the signifier, for me in my sort of in my youth, that you were sort of attached to that sort of subculture, that punk subculture.
Yeah, and I think
definitely moved beyond basketball at that point.
An interesting study would be to see what people wear now and what they wore when they were teenagers, basically, and see what kind of transitions or how the evolution of an individual style with that. Because I remember when I was in my early teenage years, Converse All-Stars. Yeah. And it was the 80s. So I remember my signature look was like turquoise high tops. That was my thing, right? And
if it's the 80s, it's got to be turquoise.
Right? And then I remember a little bit later in the 80s getting into the Nike Cortez, which is, again, I think it's a really good looking shoe. I remember with the red stripe, the blue on the midsole, white sneaker. Yeah. And then the Adidas Samba, and so there was this progression of different shoes, and, I liked all of those shoes.
Yeah.
But in the 1970s, and if we're talking about New York City in particular, once again, we're talking about the emergence of hip hop, right? Which I think was mostly referred to as rap originally. And at some point it's referred to as hip hop. And so the Adidas shoes, the Superstar and the Puma, the Suede, the Clyde, they become pretty central to hip hop culture as it first develops in New York City as well. And I mean, we have to go to Run DMC at this point, because in 1984, Run DMC drops their debut album. They're the first rap album to go gold. They're the first hip hop or rap group to be featured on the cover of Rolling Stone, the first rap group nominated for a Grammy, the first rap group to appear on MTV. And their signature look were Adidas Superstars. And a lot of times the black and white Adidas tracksuit as well. And in 1986, Run DMC released a single called My Adidas. And the shoe was all about, the song was all about the relationship with this particular shoe and trying to separate it. There was a lot of maligning of hip hop culture. There still is a lot of maligning of hip hop culture. And Run DMC, if you look at some of the lyrics there, they're trying to articulate, that this is, they're not criminals, right? That they are artists and they're rocking this particular style. And there's a famous anecdote that I've read about over and over again, where Adidas is not taking this very seriously, right? Even though that this is reaching the media outreach and the ability to market is really huge. And one of the Adidas execs goes to a Run DMC show, 86 or 87 or something like that. And at one point, it's Daryl McDaniels or Run says, all right, everybody, hold up your Adidas. And the entire crowd is holding up and waving Adidas shoes. And the exec is like, wait a minute, like, we need to do something about this right now. Like, this is a thing that made them believe. And so Run DMC becomes the first non-athlete celebrities to endorse an athletic shoe, as far as I'm aware. And so all of a sudden you have celebrities who are not athletes who are endorsing athletic shoes. And I think the Superstar at this point had faded away from being worn on the court, but it was a throwback, right, at this time as well. And this trend of shoes that were popular maybe in the past as an athletic shoe, finding new life as streetwear, and the desire for the throwback, for the retro that happened, the shoes of the 1970s and the 80s started to become really desirable, for example, in the 1990s. And one of the bands that helps communicate this is the Beastie Boys, where they're looking for the Superstars, they're looking for the Clydes, even after they've sort of fallen out of fashion a little bit. And so they're, one example of a hip hop group that is, promoting this kind of situation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think a common trend, it's probably a common trend within fashion in general, is just the cyclical nature of it, right? It's that something comes out, it gets popular. Because it's so popular, it probably loses some of its uniqueness and its brand appeal, I guess. So therefore it fades into obscurity, only to then, once it reaches a certain low point, to then get picked up by somebody who has maybe a nostalgic feel for it. And therefore it, can kind of pick up again, especially if it's by a very famous hip hop band or even athlete or something like that, right?
That's right.
And it just starts all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, we've talked a little bit about, and we'll talk a little bit more about, the moment that you see on the big screen, like on a movie screen, and particularly in the 70s, 80s, this is way pre-Netflix and streaming and everything like that, this is one of their big media moments. And, I mentioned Bruce Lee wearing the Onitsuka Tiger in Game of Death. Uma Thurman kind of reprising a different version of that shoe in Kill Bill in 2003. I don't know if you're aware of a actress named Farrah Fawcett, who was extremely popular in the 1970s. And there was a picture of her wearing the women's version of the Cortez, which were called the Señoritas. And she's on a skateboard. And she's one of the stars of Charlie's Angels. And this is in the 1970s. So watching Farrah wear this shoe helped amplify its popularity. Forrest Gump wore the Cortez.
That's right.
Right. And so that sort of reinvigorates that brand a little bit. In the 1987 film Dirty Dancing, Jennifer Grey's character wear Keds. And apparently the year after that, revenues for the company increased by tenfold, largely attributed
Wow.
to what was happening on the screen there. We talked about Sean Penn, Jeff Spicoli, the Vance checkerboard. There was a moment in the original Terminator movie where Reese, jumps out of he's lowered down onto the floor. He's wearing, I can't remember. And this is where my sneakerhead people will probably be mad at me for not knowing what model of Nike it was. But, these are the moments that particularly in the pre-internet era are really important for bringing sneakers into a national consciousness, and eventually into a global consciousness as well, to the point now where we have not only sponsorship by athletes, but musicians who are not only sponsoring, but helping to develop and design shoes. So we could talk about Kanye West,
Right.
and there's, the Yeezy, Rihanna, Cardi B, Pharrell Williams, all associated with different brands and bringing a new level of sort of credibility to wearing a particular brand.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one that I know most of that would be the Yeezys, and obviously that's attached to Kanye West. I'm not. I feel like that deal fell apart at one point.
So West originally had the agreement with Nike, and then got transferred out to Adidas and became a huge seller. And then Adidas broke their contract with Kanye West based on a bunch of things he was saying.
Right. Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
They wanted to divorce themselves from, but they had to take also a pretty big hit because it was a pretty big seller. And so it also talks about the strength of celebrity versus the strength of a particular brand, and how the celebrity themselves can be bigger than a brand almost. And we talked about Jordan shoes being a brand of itself, sort of a subdivision of Nike, sort of.
No, totally. Yeah. And I think, once you attach yourself to maybe a certain celebrity, you're, like Adidas did with Kanye West, you then, you get associated with them. And so, if that person starts saying something, then all of a sudden you're now associated with whatever they're saying. And that creates issues, right? It creates issues.
That's right.
Around the globe.
and also, we're talking about the internet era and the Twitter era, and, the ability to, for a protest to just go viral instantly almost is, advertising kind of works both ways that way. I mean, it's a way to develop things really quickly, but then a backlash can happen really quickly as well. And we're going to talk about backlash in the world of sneakers, but we're going to have to take a short break before we do that.
All right, let's do that. We'll see you in a minute.
Welcome back. It's Jeff and Hunter, the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about sneakers today, part 2. And we kind of promised that we're going to talk a little bit more about backlash and backlash to sneakers and to brands. And there was a period of time in the 1990s where there was a pretty big backlash towards a number of different brands, clothing manufacturers. And then a lot of it had to deal with sweatshop conditions in factories in Asia in particular, and other parts of the world. And then the revelation that there was maybe child labor involved in creating some products as well. And so Nike was one of the companies that received a lot of attention for this. And it wasn't that they were the only company using overseas factories, but part of it was that they're the industry leader. And attention is often focused on the business practices of industry leaders. And the idea is if you can get the industry leader to change the way that they do business, that will have a knock-on effect throughout an entire industry. And in 1991, there was a report by labor rights activist Jeff Ballinger bringing attention to the unsafe and awful working conditions, child labor, sub-minimum wage pay, less than $1 a day, in Indonesian factories in particular, some of which were subcontracted by Nike. And so various media outlets started to catch hold of this, started to write articles that were very similar to those written by Ballinger. And then in 1996, Life magazine published an article that included the photo of a 12-year-old boy who was sewing Nike soccer balls. And he was also making very little money. And so bringing this kind of attention to the larger public, people weren't able to look away from the idea that, you have a 12-year-old kid who's making a soccer ball in some part of the world and for some other 12-year-old kid in the other part of the world to play with. And, the protests, there started being protests that were held criticizing companies for their practices. Nike initially, and this is documented, I'm sort of reporting back what I've read, deflected the criticism, but then felt that they had to turn towards these issues. And, the initial thing was, well, hey, these factory employees aren't Nike employees, which is technically true. However, if they're making product for the company, it's hard to turn a blind eye to the kinds of things that are happening in a factory. And so that started to spur some kind of change. In 1999, Nike responded by joining the creation of something called the Fair Labor Association, which was charged with monitoring, protecting workers' rights. The company, Nike, began conducting health and safety audits in factories where its products were made. Various improvements are made. A code of conduct is established. Since 2005, Nike publishes annual reports about its labor practices. The company's received a lot of praise for this effort, yet there are a lot of critiques still, a lot of questions that remain regarding the pay and conditions for workers. I think a more recent report suggested that it's almost impossible for a company to claim that their company's code of conduct is being followed in every factory that they're subcontracting with. So, this debate and these issues to continue on, and it has a lot to do with globalization and this idea of the race to the bottom, which is that production of particular things, whether it's shoes or apparel or anything else, will be moving further and further to places where people are making less and less. There are less environmental standards and all these kinds of things. And this is a dynamic that consumers should be aware of, that they're part of this, that you can talk about the company's role in this, but that this is something that consumers are part of this as well, and that they should be paying attention to.
Yeah. And I think just to add a couple points onto this, as you're talking about sort of this idea of subcontractors, when you don't own your factory, you are giving up a little bit of control. And yeah, of course, you obviously, as Nike, you have the control to say, well, if you don't change this, then we're going to move our facility elsewhere. But that's not to say even you can go to another place that's saying they're going to do all this stuff, and you can even check every once in a while. But if you're still not in control, you're not, they're actively monitoring it. You never truly know what's going to happen within those facilities, right? They could immediately turn around and have, something, not good happening there.
And so,
with little oversight, right?
Right. And that's it. Oversight, transparency have to be part of the equation here, because otherwise, how are people going to know what's going on? And there's other, what they call watchdog groups, who are monitoring the way that products are made in different places and trying to hold companies that subcontract out accountable for the fact that, all right, they might not be directly your employees, but they're making your merchandise, they're making your products,
right?
And there's an obligation there. Well,
yeah, and there's a, and this is a little bit off topic, but maybe something that's more in the news today, which is the similar sort of kind of conditions that this idea of gig workers, the gig economy today, where they're being paid more than $1 per day, but there's still an underpayment because these are people who are technically contractors to the likes of, whatever, Uber or something like that.
Right.
And therefore the company itself gets to sort of scapegoat some of the responsibility towards these people in a not dissimilar way as Nike was originally able to scapegoat sort of they're people who are making their products, right? Because they weren't technically Nike
those who own the factories, those that were being subcontracted to.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I think it's worth pointing out that this is something that, a lot of companies endure. I hear about Apple, I think, constantly going through similar sort of conversations around sort of where their products are being made.
Right. And the kinds of materials that they have to draw from in order to make these incredible pieces of technical innovation, and what's at stake, what the human cost is that, and how that's felt very unevenly throughout the world. And talking about manufacturing, let's continue with that a little bit more. Approximately, and this is one statistic I found, and it's probably hard to nail down exactly, but approximately 88% of global footwear, generally, not just sneakers, that production, 88% happens in various Asian countries. And apparently over 75 of global footwear production occurs in 4 countries: China, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia.
Oh, interesting. The last one's a little bit of a surprise to me.
Yes, no, I think that's one of the places. So I think, manufacturing jobs are actually China's. There's still an enormous amount of manufacturing that's happening there, but the percentage used to be higher and it's declined in recent years. And much of this production has shifted to Vietnam and perhaps to Indonesia as well. Now, this is by contrast to the largest footwear revenue. So in which countries is the most revenue garnered from selling footwear? And number one in 2020 was the United States.
And as we were talking about sort of skateboarding culture and basketball culture, all of that sort of centered around large parts of the United States. Absolutely no surprise to me. I'm sure
right?
European countries are up there
one of the
too.
largest populations in the world. It's on average a pretty affluent population, and it's a place where you can wear sneakers to work, right?
Exactly.
And so, casual Friday is every day now, right?
Yeah.
So, also on that list for the top 5 for largest footwear generated in 2020, United States, China, Brazil, Japan, and Russia. We can look at this, we can break this down in a different way. And I have some statistics from 2021 that talk about just world share of consumption. So this is, I guess, different than revenue. And so China, India, United States, Indonesia, Brazil, which happens to be, I think, in order, the 5 most populated countries in the world as well. So there's a bit of a population thing happening here as well.
It's like one of those maps that somebody makes and it ends up just being a map of where people live.
Yeah, like the classic Twitter map. It's like, okay, you've just made a population map of the United States. The global sneaker industry today, or let's say in a couple of years ago, 2020, the global sneaker market was valued at $79 billion. But then the resale market was valued at $6 billion. And we didn't talk about this really, but that, you have a lot of limited edition shoes, sneakers that come and go really quickly, and they immediately sell out and then become worth 3 or 4 times as much or more on the secondary market. We talked about this with Lego a little bit as well.
Absolutely.
That anything that's a really hot commodity and has, that things are turned around pretty quickly, there's this incredible secondary market for sneakers.
Well, I think, I don't know if this is a recent advent. Maybe it's something that's gone with internet culture or just the, amount of, ability that people have access to information and being able to buy things. But I think we've entered into a phase of maybe capitalism where things are produced in sort of limited quantities in order to then drive this sort of scarcity mindset that then probably props up the brand a little bit, gets people interested in what the brand is, because now all of a sudden all these people who are trying to get access to this one thing and sort of uplifts everything. So we see it happen with, I think, Lego. We see it happen with sneakers. We see it happen, I think, in the video game industry as well, that these things become highly sought after, almost like commodities, right? It's almost like I just need to have it.
Well, and then it feeds the desire for the consumer to buy it right away.
Right.
Because it might disappear, and then also fosters turning over to what's new constantly as well. So it gets the consumer in the mindset of buying things instantly while it's still available, and then getting ready for the next release, the next drop. And so there have been some acquisitions in the last 20 years or so. In 2003, Nike acquired Converse. I think we mentioned that. In 2006, Adidas purchased Reebok. Called Hoka, which has become a very popular brand for sneakers, was established in France in 2009. They have a headquarters in California now. Under Armour was founded in 2006. They started as basically an undergarment factory, but they had $1.4 billion worth of footwear sales themselves in 2022.
Yeah, they're getting bigger.
They're getting bigger. They also have an HQ in Portland. I think we mentioned that as well. And so I was trying to find what the largest footwear companies were in the world, and it's a little tricky to do that. But whatever list you look at, Nike is number one. Nike is the top footwear company in the world. Adidas, number two. Sometimes I see Puma, number three. I have some information here from Statistica based on 2019 revenue, 2020 data that ranks Nike as number one, suggesting that in 2022, their revenue was $46.7 billion.
Wow.
The profit, $21.5 billion. And then the footwear sales from 21 to 22, a more recent statistic, was 29 billion plus another 2 billion from Converse. So, more than half of their revenue coming from footwear still. Adidas, number two in 2019, $26.8 billion in revenue. There's a company, it's a parent company called Kering from France that owns several luxury brands, including Gucci, Saint Laurent, Alexander McQueen, Stella McCartney. They own about 10% of Puma as well. This is a company that has $16 billion worth in sales. It's unclear to me whether that's all for footwear or not. But it also points to the idea that luxury brands like Gucci are making sneakers now as well. There is a company called VF Corporation, which is a parent company that owns Vans, Timberland, North Face, Eastpak, and Icebreaker. And they would be number four on this list. Skechers coming in at number five, a huge footwear company, where their footwear sales were $4.5 billion in 2019. Followed by New Balance, Burberry, which is a luxury brand, Asics, which we've talked about, Fila, which was originally an Italian company and I think was purchased by a Korean company in 2007, if I have that correct.
Interesting.
And then rounding out the top 10 is Wolverine Worldwide, which owns several footwear brands, including Caterpillar, Harley Davidson, Hush Puppies, and Merrell.
Interesting.
So it's hard to track some of these things, but Nike and Adidas kind of running first and second in the footwear industry seems to be what I've come up with most of the time. And so,
which is not surprising, not to me.
surprising.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Famously in competition with one another, in competition for sales, in competition for athletes, in competition for shelf space, straight up in competition. We've said a lot about sneakers and hoping we've communicated that there is some very intense, complex geographies associated with the sneaker. And that's from the very beginning all the way to the present day. We're going to have to bring it to a close now.
Well, here's what I know at the end of this episode is I think one, I think I need to buy some new sneakers.
I see.
I looked at a lot of shoes today as you were talking about them, and I'm like, oh, these look cool. Oh, these look nice.
Not necessarily our aim for the listener, but that you might not be the only person thinking that. You might be looking at some of these things that you didn't know about before.
Here's the sneaker I want the Green Flash Dunlop sneakers that has the bright green on them, but they're no longer available apparently, or at least not on the Dunlop website. You can only buy them in navy blue, which that's not Green Flash.
Sounds like it's the secondary market for you, Jeff.
It might be. I might have to get into that resale market and pay a premium for them if I really want them. But
you meet the right sneakerhead on the street, and they're going to ask you, why are you wearing those, and why aren't those in a box? Probably. So that's the other thing.
Anyways, okay. Well, let's close it out here. Let's do some pluggables, Hunter.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University, co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left City is a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. My co-author is David Banas, and I am co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything, with you, Jeff.
Yeah, and my name is Jeff Gibson, co-host of the podcast with Hunter. Geography is Everything, obviously. I'm also on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. You can find me there, as well as various places around the web. I think at this point, Instagram will have their new Twitter clone out there, so I'll probably be on that. It's called Threads. Probably just Geography by Jeff would be my guess is what my
remember
username
to look
will
for
be.
Jeff with the G also, remember.
Also Jeff with a G, yeah. Hopefully people have caught on by now, but if you haven't, yeah, I'm a Geoff. That's the whole Geography Jeff thing. That's what makes it all make sense.
Your name was, you didn't rebrand yourself. That was
I didn't rebrand myself. No. I always like to make this call, but if you liked what you listened to today, I thought these were two very fun episodes, part 1 and part 2. If you liked it as well, please go ahead and rate and review us over on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you're using to listen to, if that option exists. I really like seeing those come in. And finally, please join us over on geographyiseverything.substack.com, where we have a geography community there. We write articles there. Oftentimes those articles become sort of main podcast episodes, so it can be a little bit of a sneak peek. There's a bunch of fun stuff happening over there, and we'll continue to evolve that. But join us over there because we're building a fun community. I think next week we kick off another 2-part series on the space race. So that should be a fun one. We're going to start with sort of the history, I would say how it's sort of breaking out is sort of part 1 is going to be the historic space race, right? And there's a lot of Cold War implications that get factored in there. Very interesting geography attached to that. And then part 2 is going to be kind of about the modern day space race as sort of new people, I would say people personalities, but also new countries get involved and sort of private corporations start getting involved. So
I look forward to that. I feel like I know a lot more about the first part of that. So
I think generally a lot of people will be very familiar with sort of the first parts because, well, I don't want to launch into it, but obviously NASA is such a hugely influential part of a very specific era of the United States. Yeah. So that should be a really fun one. So come back, I guess, in a week from now, and you can start listening to that. Until then,
please stay tuned and thank you for listening.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.